Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Learning Collective. We're so excited to be able to continue these sessions and offer these learning opportunities for everybody in our community while we're all still safely at home at this time. I'm Ann Wynn, Marketing Specialist at Risk, and this morning I've got two gentlemen I think you guys may recognize. We've got Art Werkenthin, who is the President of Risk, and then Duncan Welder, Director of Client Services. Both Art and Duncan speak quite often on the conference circuit, so you may have had an opportunity to see them speak and present about xAPI, CMI5, data strategy, and so on. And this morning, they're going to be presenting about how to use learning technology to drive retention. Learner retention is often very challenging for organizations and training professionals. And now with the advent of xAPI and other learning technologies, we're able to drive retention, able to analyze it, track it, and able to make the pivots that we need to make changes to help drive retention. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring on their presentation and take it away, gentlemen. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ann. Great introduction, and we're certainly thrilled to be here, have the opportunity while everyone is staying underground a bit to get out and share some information, and then gather information from other folks. I know we have a couple more Learning Collective sessions today with Chad Udell and Judy Katz, and then one next week. I know Dr. Jen Murphy is on, so good opportunity, and appreciate the chance to be here and the people that are joining. So depending on where you are in the world, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, and glad to have you. I'm Duncan Welder. My partner on the line is Art Werkenthin, and I think Ann has covered most of this. But contact information if you ever need us. Like I said, we tend to be pretty easy to find. So, why are we here? And I think one of the things for me that really drove taking a look at this functionality that we have now with especially new tools and xAPI, one of those. So as we were working with xAPIs from that early new adopter phase, just happened to come across this quote in Make It Stick, where it's people are generally going about learning in the wrong ways. Okay, well, what are the right ways, and what do we need to do to improve, and what are the tools that are in our toolbox now that we can enhance to make learning better, more efficient, more effective, especially in a time like this where we are all kind of coming up with new ways to learn. So this is really our initial driver and started the conversation here, which followed pretty quickly to challenges. So for those of you online, I'd love to have you enter thoughts or comments in the chat box. What are some of the biggest challenges that you have with instructor-led training, those synchronous events? And I won't be make too much distinction between those that are actually in a classroom versus those in a virtual classroom kind of world, but something that's really that synchronous event that's led by an instructor versus those challenges that you have on an e-learning front. And again, I'll take a broad brush in the definition here, but generally in the e-learning side of the world, I'm thinking of things that are self-paced, things that you would go through more solo as opposed to that instructor-led activity. All right, so let's see. I'm trying to keep an eye on comments as well. Some of those challenges that have arisen there, right, are knowledge check interactivity, right? When I'm in that classroom session and there's an instructor that's kind of sage on the stage position that's going over information, I don't always have it. Some people are far better than this than others. So again, don't want to cast an aspersion there, but really, how much opportunity is there to get that knowledge check in? Often in a classroom, unless you have a lab or a simulation, the hands-on experience can be limited. Again, especially doing things that if you were in the real world would be in a very different scenario. Maybe an area if you're doing technical training that could be hot or noisy or all those things that can make it difficult to train really in that situation. But that means when you remove that into the classroom, you've got some limited experience or limited opportunities for hands-on experience. Again, one of the others, and I think primarily with instructor-led training, but also happens some with self-paced training or e-learning, is that dictated pace, right? We're going to run at a speed that meets kind of the majority of the class. You've got some folks that are more advanced and want to move ahead, some that are falling further behind and need some additional time. But you don't have that luxury as often. There's the scheduling and time piece, and really that works regardless, or is a challenge regardless of whether it's e-learning or it's an instructor-led session. So how do we manage getting people, especially if they have to take them off the job or they're working overtime, and get that training done? There's a lack of post-event follow-up, and we'll talk a lot about post-event follow-up while we go through this presentation, because it's one of the things that I think that xAPI can really help us out with, and is far more valuable than I think a lot of folks realize. And then a couple of things that I think are a little more specific to e-learning, online training, would be that low SME interactivity, right? Because I don't have the opportunity to raise a hand and ask a question of a subject matter expert. But then also, I think that there's a little pushback in some areas, and probably rightly so, for I've just been assigned this online training as a check the box activity, and I have to get through it. So that a lot of things that can be challenges to both instructor-led and for e-learning, because the reality is the vast majority of both instructor-led and e-learning that we do now is just massed learning. It's cramming to try to get information processed. We've got to get through all this content. We've got to pass a test at the end of it, and then I'm going to let all of that stuff just disappear, which is not really the focus of are doing training, right? We really need to focus on making some kind of impact, right? To stay valuable to the organization. But this mass learning, this cramming, what immediately happens is you've pulled the all-nighter, you've gone through, you've read whatever you need to read, you're ready for the test, you jam it through, and then all that learning just decays, or we would commonly call forgetting. And this curve has been around for I would say years, decades, technically centuries now. So it was in the late 1800s that Ebbinghaus came up with this forgetting curve, and I'm not going to worry too much about the percentages and times. I think those all vary a bit, depending on a number of variables. But the reality of it is that if I receive content, I'm trained on something, I read it, and I don't apply it, I don't use it, I don't have to activate that new piece of information, it will eventually just drain right out of my head, and I'm left with very little value for the time that we've spent in training. So how do we fix this, right? And this is the real point of what we're doing today, is trying to make this learning decay curve less steep, right? We want to maintain that information, be more efficient in what we're presenting. So there are a few things that the brain needs to support retention, right? So we get information flowing in all of the time as different stimulus into our kind of sensory memory, the things that we're immediately taking in. Now, some of those we don't even notice because there's interference, and it's only those things that we're focused on that we have we're gazing some attention on, that we can move those things into working memory. This is one of those that I always use the analogy of taking the same route to work back in the days when people drove cars. To an office or wherever you're going, and then one day somebody else drives you, and you're like, oh wow, I didn't know all this new stuff was built in this area. I've never noticed that building before, whatever, because I just can't focus on every piece of stimulus that's coming in while I'm trying to operate a vehicle. But those things I do focus my attention on go into working memory, and that's where I have the opportunity to practice and rehearse that information. There's still interference there, and there's some things that lead to forgetting. But if I can start working with that information, using it, applying it, doing some synthesis there, then what I begin to do is really encode that information into my long-term memory. And the deeper I can make those connections, the more context I have inside those neural networks, then the easier it is, or the more opportunities I have to retrieve that information, retrieve it in some meaningful way. Now, there's still decay there from long-term memory. And I've realized as I'm getting older, my decay rate from long-term memory is much faster than it was just a few years ago. But this process continues to go on. But if you don't continue to rehearse, to practice, to retrieve that information, then those things become difficult to pull back out. And again, those things they're needed to encode things from short-term to long-term memory and develop those neural networks is very often associating new information with existing information, because the better tethered I am between experience or emotion to that new bit of information, then it helps solidify those connections in my brain, making it easier for me to recall that information. This is why often traumatic experiences or major events that are tied to some kind of emotional happening, you'll remember for very long periods of time. But how do you do that? How do we make these kind of connections? A few things we could do just from an overall strategy standpoint. First, there's context, right? So I need to, as an adult with prior information in my head, I need to have a context for this new information to hold on to. So this is a place where often, analogy works so well for helping someone understand a situation. How does this fit inside the world with the things I already understand? So I want that kind of informed instruction. I want to know why, right? Versus the very rote learning your multiplication tables without a great bit of background there. As adults, we look to solve a problem. So having training delivered with that problem solution focus is important. Again, having experience or foundation in your existing experience, trying to find some commonalities there in that content is important. And then, of course, reinforcement. So, once I receive information one time, I can't be expected to retain that forever. I need some activities to keep going, and I have some reinforcement there. We're going to look at three very specific strategies in the rest of this presentation. One of those is space learning, and then another is active recall and interleaving. We've got a couple different examples there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Art Werkenthin to pick up with what is space learning.
All right, thank you. So the idea behind space learning is to break the forgetting curve by delivering a lot of repetitive training. You want to deliver small pieces of learning. They come with space between them, so they're separated over time. and you try to reinforce previous learning with a lot of repetition. So it's not taking some content you have and breaking it down into small segments and delivering it over several days. It's a design change. You have to be focused on repeating without boring, delivering training over time, and in small chunks. Those are the three key elements of it. And then with each chunk, you can build new information. You can add a little bit on and a little bit on and a little bit on. And I'll show an example of that later in this presentation. So with the forgetting curve being the red curve starting at the top and going down, and it does deteriorate pretty rapidly in the Ebbinghaus studies. What we're trying to do is invert that curve with spaced learning. So instead of delivering a whole bunch of training at the beginning like we are with the red forgetting curve, with the green curve, we're delivering small pieces of information. And then we wait a day, then we deliver another small piece of information, again, repeating a lot of what we've done in the first piece of content. And we just continue to do this and continue to do this and try to get the curve to go up instead of down so that people will remember longer. And there are a lot of studies of spaced learning showing that it can actually improve retention by as much as 50%. So it's doing a good job of breaking the forgetting curve and getting people to retain information longer. On top of which, our own experience with it is people enjoy it a lot more because they're not cramming information in. They're not watching an e-learning module for an hour. They're watching microlearning for 5 minutes on their phone. And then they get another one the next day, and another one the next day, and so on. So is spaced learning microlearning? No, it's not. It's all spaced learning is some kind of microlearning because it's intended to be small, but all microlearning is not spaced. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, again, you have to keep repeating in spaced learning. And you'll notice I'm giving you spaced learning because I keep repeating that. You have to space it out over time, not just break it up into small chunks, and you have to do the repeating. There's actually been an interesting study of learning from Training Magazine in a survey of 1,200 learners. What they're finding is that in this survey, that the value that learners find in the training is mostly in the post-learning content. The learning value event, the event itself, is only 24% of the value of the overall content, and the pre-learning is 25%. So those two combined just add up to the value of the post-learning. So follow-on activities are more important to learners than that one-time event. And that's actually reinforcement that spaced learning is not only improving memory of students and retention, but providing them more value, and they tend to like it better. So if you look at this in kind of a chart form, the pre-work and the learning event is in the value. The top bar is the value the students place on the learning and the different pieces. But the bottom bar is what people actually do in L&D. So we tend to spend the majority of our time, 85% is what they found in this survey, on developing the learning event itself, the hour of e-learning or the day of ILT, and very little on pre-work and post-work. Yet learners are giving us the exact opposite answer on what they find valuable. So perhaps we're focusing on the wrong thing. So why aren't we doing it? This has been around for a long time. As Duncan mentioned, since the late 1800s, this has been known about memory and cognitive science. Why do we not do it? Well, first of all, it's hard to track, or it has been in the past. Maybe you don't need to track it, but most people want to track it, especially if they're spending their corporation's money to show that they are providing value. It's also hard to manage. You've got to send training out over time. You have to know what modules somebody has completed and then send them the next one, track that it's done, send them the next one. And how do you deliver that to them? Is it an email? Can you send them a text message with a link to the content? All of that has been in the past relatively hard to do and required specialized effort. The developmental effort, as I mentioned earlier, is more because, as I said, you cannot just take an hour-long e-learning and break it up into 10 pieces and think you've done the job of spaced learning. It doesn't work that way. You have to have both the repetition and the spacing to make it work. You also need some kind of interoperability, both with your tracking and then if you're marketing training, how are you going to sell this to other people? Maybe they don't have a system that can manage it like that, do the spacing and do the tracking. So what kind of interoperability are you going to get if you just drop this into an LMS? It's very difficult. So with the advancement of xAPI, we've now got a tool that can help us quite a bit with spaced learning. One of the things that xAPI is very good at is tracking learning that occurs outside the LMS. If you think about good spaced learning, it's typically 10 minutes or less. Now that's kind of anecdotal from our using it. I don't actually have a study I can cite showing 10 minutes is the magic number. But if you just try taking 10 minutes of e-learning on your phone, after about 10 minutes, you're pretty bored with it and ready to go do something else. So we try to keep our stuff under 10 minutes. But with xAPI, we can send them a link to it. They can take the training, we can track it, and they do the training in possibly less time than it takes to log on to the LMS. xAPI also gives us the ability to easily analyze learner behavior. We can see what parts of the training they're going through. We can see where they're stopping, which is one of the things we notice when we have our training too long, is they'll go through a few pages and then just quit and not come back to it. We can track that with xAPI. You also have the ability with xAPI to adapt your training to the learner. So if you're delivering 20 modules over a period of several weeks and you see certain behaviors going on in the learning, you can easily change the rest of the modules to look at and adapt to learner behavior. You can also see which parts of the training that they're hitting and which parts they're skipping. If you have audio or video, or those things being played, or are people just reading through and getting to the end as quickly as they can. So you can adapt your training fairly easily with spaced learning by delivering it in small chunks and tracking it with xAPI. So what is the process, at least in our model, for delivering it? You've got to have credentialing and management because you want to know who the student is, so you're delivering the right module to the right person. And what is the content that should be delivered? In our case, we use CMI5 or xAPI, again, because we don't want people logging into the LMS. With xAPI, you could bypass that. How do we know who the person is without violating PII? Well, we embed a token. When we send them a link, it's an encrypted token that's unique just to that individual, so we can keep track of they've done module 1, 2, 3, and they're now due for module 4. The frequency is actually managed by an LMS in our case, because we've got one that can do that. But it could be a learning experience platform. It could be a custom program. It could be an Excel spreadsheet if you're going to manually send out messages. In our case, how is learning delivered? SMS or email. We have found that using SMS is very effective. People tend to do learning that they get in the text message, provided again that it's short and it runs on their phone, very quickly. Email tends to sit around for a while. It may sit for several days before the student opens it and clicks the link, whereas SMS gets a very quick response. So we have found that to be more effective. And then how do we follow up? Well, if we're sending them SMS and they have opted in, we continue to follow up with text messages. If they're doing email, we do that. And then we've got reporting that we get back on the process and who's completed what back to management. So how is this delivery accomplished? Well, in our case, we've got an LMS running in the background with a built-in learning record store. So we start there, and the LMS periodically, through a mail process, sends out text messages or emails to the students with the modules that are currently due. The learner goes in through their phone. Some of them may opt to use a desktop, but most of them have been opting to use their own phone. Does the training, that gets communicated to the LRS, and then the completions get recorded by the LMS, which then sits around and waits for the next delivery. So every day it's checking, is it time to send another module? And then for each student, what module needs to be sent, depending upon where they are in the process. You don't need a system to do space learning. You can even use it with ILT. Homework is one of the traditional ways of delivering follow-up content, not necessarily popular. But it is a way to do space learning. One of the recommendations I would have about homework is try to make it low consequence or no consequence. People are more likely to use it as a learning technique if there's no penalty for getting things wrong. Email, of course, is another way to follow up. If you do an ILT, you might send an email the next day summarizing your key points, and then maybe a few days later do the same thing. Discussion groups are a great way for students to discuss what they've learned, show what they've learned, but also reinforce their learning by using one of the other techniques we're covering in this presentation, and that is active recall. Webinars are a good way that you can deliver it. Again, I think they should be short. You're just delivering little pieces of information and repeating. Mobile apps, surveys, microlearning, which we use a lot of, videos. You can give students a research request to go find out information that reinforces the learning that you delivered. Peer-to-peer, you can have students discussion groups, forums, and personal development plans where you assign particular activities to a student based on their needs for the training you're trying to get active recall.
All right, and Art's mentioned active recall a couple times, so I wanted to jump in with a definition there. This is something we're all familiar with in practice, if not in the term. But active recall is really just stimulating memory. A lot of times it's called the testing effect. So, when you walked into, the biology classroom and, the teacher asked you to pull out a sheet of paper, and we're going to do a pop quiz over the things we did yesterday. And then, you pass that maybe to, the person in front of you or behind you, and you go through and you grade it and you talk through this process. Again, like Art mentioned, maybe not something that has a consequence. It could, right? There could be a grade recorded in that, but really the purpose is to make you think about that previous information and try to pull it forward again to help you build that link of memory again, because it continues to solidify those neural networks, allows you to bring those kind of memories up. And everybody knows one of the ways, we've all done it at some time. One of the big tools that uses or relies on active recall are flashcards, right? So, here's a question, I look at it, I try to synthesize an answer, I flip it over and see the correct answer on the back, and maybe I got it, maybe I didn't, maybe there's a little more explanation there, but something where I'm forced to try to come up with that answer based on new information. And there are a lot of applications now that tap into the power of flashcards, but in an electronic way. So instead of drawing out on an index card, it's a screenshot is asking questions about a car there, and you can flip over and look at additional information. I know there's another group, Flip out of Michigan, that has a flashcard application as well. And there is even in the xAPI world, for those geeky like me, there's a profile for flashcards. If you're going to have flashcards inside an application, and they're going to write to a learning record store using xAPI, there's already a pattern established and set that we can use for consistent reporting, right? Which is one of those things that to me is always super important. The benefits of xAPI in so many of these kind of applications, even though we could do these things before, they were always built for a specific purpose. So you lost your interoperability. But now, assuming everyone follows the same profile for flashcards, it really doesn't matter what flashcard application you're using. We should be able to report on that information consistently there. So again, just something to allow you to pull more information back up, get your mind on the content that had been delivered previously, and start building more of those links. The other thing that Art's mentioned a couple times is the concept of interleaving. And this is one that I recognized with my children, well, back when everyone was in elementary school, where they'd come in and say, all right, so what'd you do at school today? I'm like, well, in math we did, this. And say, all right, what'd you do in? I said, good to find a good example. What'd you do in history? And say, okay, we were studying states. And say, okay, what'd you do in math? Well, we were looking at states and their populations. And then what were you doing in reading? Well, we were reading about the process for states to become states. Like, wait, so every class is coordinated with the exact same topic every day? And the answer is really yes, but with a very different focus, right? What are the, how do we focus on math in this area? How do we focus on science in this area? But the fact that all of these topics were similar allows me to start, as I'm building those neural networks, attach one piece of information to another there. So I have multiple context for the same information, the same types of information, even though I'm receiving that information through maybe a whole bunch of different methods. So again, super valuable for really increasing the depth that we hold information, and it works well in both academic and kind of motor skills for learning and for improved retention. The question now is, how can xAPI help that? If we're looking at having multiple classes that all have similar topics and crossover, what do we do? How do we manage that process? One of the first things I realized there, and it was really a client of ours that brought this to the table, and what she said was that they have all of this training content that they deliver, and they weren't sure what things were being mastered. When people pass tests so they could move on to the next thing. But as far as specific objectives, what's being mastered, and what they really wanted to look at was whether the topic of personal protective equipment exists in content module 1 or class 2 or module 5. Across all of those elements, am I mastering that topic? Not could I get through one specific training topic focused on an item. So one of the things that they did is went back in using xAPI, edited the questions inside. They had a ton of SCORM content, safety focused. And if you see the screenshot there on the page, it's a bit difficult to read. Down the left-hand side of that bar chart are different objective names. That one at the top that says unknown, that super long bar, is SCORM content that hasn't been hasn't had xAPI added to the questions to associate a question with a particular objective. So one of the first things they did, went through, updated their content, so now they had this greater view of, for a specific objective, regardless of the training module or content element that it came from. What is someone's mastery, and how do I drill down into those? And so now the focus for remediation or providing additional training is really at the more granular topic level than that overall content module. They went even beyond that to build some additional dashboards where they could associate their performance checklists with those objectives, and they could drive all the way down into individual questions that were answered correctly, not answered correctly, what number of times, percentage of times, so tying a little bit of item analysis in as well, but it allowed them to be much more free in their development of content, because their focus isn't as module driven as, all right, what am I measuring here from a knowledge standpoint, and then hopefully driving that retention up. Art has another good example here. I'll kick him back over to him for.
Yeah, I've been studying Spanish since December. My wife and I like to vacation in Mexico, so if we ever get to take vacations again. And so I've been using Duolingo, and I find that it is really a well-done application in terms of spaced learning and interleaving and active recall, all in this one essentially free application. So anybody can try it out to see how they're doing spaced learning. In this particular screenshot, I've got several categories of things to learn in Spanish. So there's an intro, there's a travel topic, a restaurant topic, a family topic. And in terms of spaced learning, the Duolingo, when you start up, recommends that you do about 10-15 minutes a day, and then you put it down. And if you do that, you're absolutely doing spaced learning. And one of the follow-on techniques that it does is periodically it will go back and break your completion. So you can see in the bottom left, my restaurant circle has been broken. I completed that actually all the way back in December, but it still shows up every once in a while, and it breaks it, and I have to go back in and redo the content. It's again repeating, and it's spaced out. As I said, it's only doing 2 to 3 lessons per day. And that is also an example of interleaving, because although I'm in Spanish in all of those topics, they're grouped by travel, restaurant, etc. In terms of active recall, this is a page where I'm matching Spanish words with English words. And most of these words are things I learned early on, and then there may be 1 or 2 new ones. So this is an example of both spaced learning and active recall. And this is a no consequence item. In Duolingo, when you get something wrong, it takes away a point. And you have 5 points during the day. Each day you're given up to 5 points, whatever your maximum is. And then it takes away points for everything you make a mistake on. When it's doing this little test, which appears probably once or twice per lesson, and it's doing an active recall, you don't lose points for getting these things wrong. You get an unlimited number of tries. So it's a no consequence activity that's forcing me to burn those pathways in the brain to know which Spanish word goes with which English word. So it's doing a great job with that. There's one thing I don't like about Duolingo, and that is the leaderboard. I think this leaderboard is probably broken Duolingo for a lot of people. If you look at the top, people, of course, take a leaderboard as a challenge. You've got somebody with 2,600 plus points. You get about 10 to 12, maybe 15 points per lesson that you complete. So that person has probably completed somewhere over 200 lessons in a week. That person is probably not going to recall anything. They are cramming, to go back to the very beginning of this presentation, and probably within just a few days of doing those 215 lessons, they're forgetting most of what's in there. So if you're going to have a leaderboard in your systems, I would recommend that it not be based on completions, because all you're doing is encouraging the forgetting curve.
Yeah, gross number of completions like that. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. All right. So Duolingo, great example there. What I wanted to really to wrap us up with here as we're sliding up towards the quarter to the top of the hour mark are some of the next steps, because we talked about different tools that we've used in trying to apply active recall and space learning, interleaving. But what are the tools that you have in your toolbox now? Because that's where all these things started with us, right? Is it wasn't that we went out and bought new things necessarily. I guess Duolingo was we went out and said, oh gosh, this really applies and works well for this. But what are my existing tools, and what's the ability that I have to make some changes, maybe like those folks that added the objectives to their content so that they could go back in and do some additional analysis there. Now that we know what those tools are, where do I have opportunities and what's the biggest impact, right? If I need to rework content, like Art was saying with spaced learning, then I probably want to focus on higher impact, higher consequence kind of training where I really need some long-term retention and things there versus, maybe kind of doing a carte blanche conversion of content there. So what are the things that I can really leverage and get the most mileage out of? There's also absolutely a concern with taking a look at the culture and infrastructure inside your organization. If people do not have smartphones, then sending out content via text message for them to complete on the small screen is probably not going to work. They don't have that capability. And even in places I've worked with that felt like they had a good handle on infrastructure, there are almost always a exception or two in there. So something to look at on that side. The other piece, and culturally, I really just mean there, will it be accepted? In some cultures, say, worked a lot in union facilities, and there are things that just don't fly. You can't do work at home. You can't send me an assignment to take over the weekend while I'm off. It does not work in that kind of culture. So, what does work inside your organization's culture? Then, of course, developing a data strategy and governance. If we're going to start collecting information, use that to make business decisions, use that to inform the way that we design training. We need to have some strategy for the information that we're going to gather, how we're going to use that, what's our level of transparency with students. Does some of that data need to be in an aggregate format versus individualized? A lot of things to think about, and something that I think all L&D departments really at this point should have some focus or awareness on is what is my data strategy and how am I going to manage that, especially in a world with GDPR and data privacy regulations and those things, but also not just checking the box for staying in legal compliance, but realistically, what is the valuable information that you do want to capture? And finally, there's the process of evaluating and updating. Art mentioned earlier going through content, and if people are having problems being able to modify those because you've broken up all those elements out over time. What are the things we can do to improve in a continuous way, right? So this is something that we never stop doing, always evaluating, trying to figure out if there's a new, a better way to do those things. And again, that's part of the reason that we're here and sharing today. I think one of the final things that that's always critical, and one that is easy to lose focus on, especially if we're excited about new techniques or strategies or tools, is forgetting the learner, and that's not something we ever want to do. So, what are the needs of those students? Whereas, again, part of that is getting back to our impact. Let's be as focused as possible in creating value there and minimizing the waste of time. And that's why I think having training that's more effective from a retention standpoint, efficient from a time standpoint, really is an important goal for us to have as an industry. I did include, pardon me, I did include some references here, so access to to things like articles on space learning and CMI5, some xAPI for evaluation of learning. So good resources that are out there, and of course, Art and I are super easy to find. Like I said, I'm Duncan W at risk-inc.com. He is Art W at risk-inc.com. No relation. And we're super active on the Twitter side of the world. I'm Duncan WIV. Art is a Werkenthin because he wanted to pick the easier name to use for spelling. But again, both of us easy to find. Always glad to chat about things there. I think I'm going to pull Ann back on and see if we have any questions that we need to get to.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was a great presentation. I've seen it several times, but it always helps me to learn more. I don't see any comments currently, but if you are watching this as a replay, feel free to drop in your questions or comments, and we'll make sure that Art and or Duncan will get back with you with any answers. I've also tweeted out some resources that we have on our risk blog about space learning. And then again, this video will remain here on our Facebook page as an accessible resource at any time of the day or night, and it will also reside on our YouTube channel. If you are joining us a little later, in about half an hour, we've got Chad Udell from Float on talking about the shock of the new. He's going to share his insights on learning technologies. And then this afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern, we've got Judy Katz talking about how to make your e-learning more representative. So that's one that you definitely do not want to miss. I've not had a chance to catch that session at any of the conferences, so I'm super excited to have her on presenting that information. And thank you for joining us this morning. Just as a reminder, please feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media channels and let us know who else you would like to hear from or what other topics you would like to hear about. And we'll be happy to try to make that happen for you. From the RISC team, thank you for joining us this morning. We'll see you again in a little bit for the next sessions today.
Thank you.
Yeah.